Okay, thank you very much to the organizers who invited me here. It's a wonderful reason to come to Athens and to come to this institute. We have, as some people have remarked, we have a little series on Alexander, and unavoidably there is some interconnection, overlap, and so I was very anxious what Istvan was going to talk about, and to some extent what he said fits to what I have to say, and we'll probably learn even more from Melina's talk. So you will have to fit everything together in a coherent story. First of all, Alexander of Aphrodisias on cosmic order. Well, Alexander of Aphrodisias doesn't need much introduction, so I will not spend my time on this. We have actually quite a lot of work from Alexander. We have seen how much information is still hidden in the commentators, the later commentators who use Alexander for all kinds of purposes. Apart from the commentaries by Alexander himself and the fragments in other commentaries, there are also quite a number of writings by Alexander himself. Of course, for each and every topic, ideally you should have to cover this ground entirely, which is impossible. That is why we have divided our tasks for today. I will limit myself to 3 main texts of Alexander on the principles of the universe, a few questiones, mainly to 3, and I will just briefly refer to a passage in the Metaphysics commentary. And Alexander is there drawing upon another, I was going to say, limited number of texts of Aristotle, which is true, but of course they are very monumental texts, the 8th book of the Physics, the 12th book of the Metaphysics, the motu animalium, and of course the infamous De Mundo, which Alexander thought was written by Aristotle. So we have to take that into account as well. I will have a look at the connection between the first cause of the universe and the rest of the universe. Alexander adopted a few analogies from Aristotle and the Peripatetic tradition, and gave them a twist of his own. At least that is my argument. Nature, form, and soul become more and more synonymous under the influence of a so-called divine power, a theia dynamis, that the first cause somehow spreads through the universe in an ordered sequence of events, starting from the motion it inspires in the divine heavenly bodies. Now, in Aristotle's works, the order of the universe is explained by the interplay of 4 causal powers, summarized in the maxim, nature, which includes all 4, is the cause of order in everything, which is in the first chapter of book 8 of the Physics. Now, as is well known, in book 7 and 8, Aristotle tries to reduce all changes to circular motion, and circular motion to the first cause of motion, which is completely immobile, therefore without potentiality, incorporeal, and eternal. But in Physics 8, Aristotle doesn't really explain how such a baffling thing can be the starting point of motion. His next attempt at this problem, Aristotle's next attempt, is found in Metaphysics Labda. He summarizes the findings of his physical works, and then in chapter 7 he argues there is then something which is always moved with an unceasing motion, which is motion in a circle. And this is plain not in theory, but also in fact. These are the heavens that we actually see. The heavens must be eternal, therefore there is also something which moves them. And since that which is moved and moves is intermediate, there must be a mover which moves without being moved, being eternal substance and actuality. And then he throws in the phrase the object of desire and the object of thought cause motion in this way. They cause motion without being moved. These are, of course, very famous sentences, but there has been an endless amount of discussion what they mean. And Aristotle continues, the primary objects of desire and thought are the same. For the apparent good is the object of appetite, and the real good is the object of wish, rational choice. Thus it produces motion by being loved, this first cause, and the things moved move the other things. The first mover then, of necessity, exists, and insofar as it is necessary, it is good, and in this sense a first principle. So he's very quickly connecting all the big words of metaphysics. And then he concludes, on such a principle depend the heaven and nature. In this way, Aristotle seems to spell out that his first principle is a final cause. But how does this work? Do the heavenly bodies literally love or desire this cause? Or do they have it as the object of their thought? Or all of the above? So, if so, the heavenly bodies need a psychology. So, what is the psychology of the heavenly bodies? We get some further information about this from various places in Aristotle. In the Anima 310 and the De Motu Animalium, Aristotle pursues the prospects of the object of desire as the unmoved mover. And in addition, in the De Motu Animalium, Aristotle connects the case of individual living beings, on the one hand, with the case of the universe as a whole. So, if later commentators try to do the same thing, connect the workings of the universe to the workings of individual living beings, then they have Aristotle's blessing, or so they might think. So this is the object of desire as an unmoved mover. In Metaphysics Labda, in the sequel of Metaphysics Labda, equally famous, the characterization of the first principle pursues the notion of an object of thought. But again, that doesn't really help to understand the mechanics of the thing. This principle, this first principle, turns out to be a perfect act of thought which can only have itself as its object. Mind you, this God is not a creator, is not a conscious, rational creator. His influence rests entirely on the fact that everything else exists for its sake, whatever that may mean. And Aristotle emphasizes, as we saw earlier, that the first principle must be separate from the sensible world it is the principle of. So are we now any closer to understanding the dazzling variety of orderly arrangements in the universe, all coming from this first principle? It is a problem not only the connection between the first cause and the heavens, but also the relation between the motions of the heavens and all the varied but orderly effects of that motion in the sublunary realm. And again, Aristotle provides hints rather than complete solutions. Yes, there is an orderly arrangement of the various heavenly bodies that transmit the first motion from the outer sphere further down, step by step, towards the sublunary realm. Okay. The sun and the moon affect the sublunary realm in other ways too. The changing position of the sun moving along the ecliptic causes the seasons, and therefore processes of generation and corruption. And the heat of the sun also causes exhalations from water and earth, which cause further geological and meteorological phenomena. But these processes seem sort of haphazard, arbitrary, and crude. So once again, where does the inherent order and limitation of all this come from? Theophrastus, Aristotle's critical pupil, listed numerous problems for this type of account. The sublunary realm was already severed from the heavenly spheres by the fact that the spheres consist of ether, which doesn't interact with the four elements. And now the whole thing is crowned by a separate, self-absorbed intellect, so why does the universe not fall apart? Shall the intelligible and the sensible ever meet? Theophrastus is not happy either with the idea of desire or love for the first principle. And he already connects this notion of love and desire for the first principle with the notion of imitation. Of course, only to reject it as an untenable Platonic notion. For he says, what would happen if the rotating bodies would turn their desire elsewhere? And why does imitation of a motionless principle lead to a perfect motion? Shouldn't they strive to be motionless, like their example? Would that be much easier not to move? Now this problem, this set of problems has, as you all know, been given two main types of solutions. The first one is to say that the first principle is, or at least is also an efficient cause, a creator of sorts, preferably a rational one, who bestows order on the universe. Plato's demiurge is one example, although he needs lesser gods and the world soul to do the real work. And we have the Stoic god. He is, in a sense, an improvement because he has managed to pervade the universe entirely, thus removing many of Theophrastus' worries about the unity of the universe. And it seems to be to his credit that he doesn't need a whole bunch of co-workers to get the job done. He seems more powerful. Now, in order to solve all these problems at the same time, which is what Alexander is doing, he starts by emphasizing a number of connections in peripatetic thought, much more explicitly than Aristotle did. And his motivations to do so were, as I suggested, threefold. First, to answer Theophrastus' concerns. It's common ground that the entire commentary tradition, including Alexander, takes Theophrastus' criticism seriously, so that's really always in the background for many of their concerns. Of course, Stoicism can't be right. I know some people have invested something in Stoicism, but of course, if you are with Alexander, you can't believe Stoics. So the Stoics' God just cannot be accepted. The Stoic God is engaged in menial activities. He goes down to the bottom of the universe, busying himself with all sorts of menial stuff a god shouldn't concern with. It's unworthy of a highest principle. So that's a main argument. And then Alexander also has a fairly recent opponent in Atticus, also in Athens, around the same time, slightly earlier, who, which is your text 3 on the handout, I will not go into that, but who has formulated a set of criticisms of Aristotle's thought as well. So he was sort of challenged, let's put it this way, he was challenged from three sides, and therefore Alexander had to come up with a good story. So what does he do? I could give a talk about each of these bullet points, so I will not do that. So what does he do? First, he identifies the unmoved mover of Physics 8 with the first cause of Metaphysics Lambda. And in Quaestio 1.1, we actually find a combined argument, combining arguments from Physics 8 and Metaphysics Lambda 6 and 7 into an argument by analysis, as he calls it, from effects to cause, to establish the nature of the first cause. As we would expect, Alexander's first cause is also eternal, pure actuality, the highest intelligible object there is. And from all this, Alexander concludes that the first cause is also a substance and nature in the sense of form, the highest substantial form around in the universe. And at the same time, precisely as Aristotle requires, it is also the highest object of desire, because it is good to the highest degree. So this is the identification which has become so customary that many handbooks believe that this is explicit in Aristotle, but it is not. Moreover, Alexander creates a special psychology for the heavenly bodies. First of all, the heavenly bodies are the best bodies in the universe. So they must be alive, because to be alive is better than not to be alive. If you are alive, you have a soul. But of course you want to be the best kind of soul, so you must be rational. As it happens, because the heavens are made of ether, they don't have affections. They don't need the lower parts of the soul. So the heavenly bodies have rational souls, pure rational souls. If there are then, according to Aristotle, three types of desire, appetite, passion, and will, boulesis, well, they can have only will. They can have only boulesis. And of course, this is an unchanging rational desire for the first principle. So, with this psychology, indeed, for these unique rational souls, the first principle is both the object of their rational desire and the object of their thought. Despite Theophrastus' concerns, Alexander also connects rational desire for the first principle with the desire to become like the first principle. But he adds something very important, as far as their nature allows. So the heavenly bodies strive to be similar, but as far as nature allows. That is why they move, although their example does not. So far, so good. We still haven't made much progress, I think, in finding out how exactly this wonderful first cause manages to be responsible for the order in the universe. Especially if it's not a Platonic demiurge, or a world soul, or a Stoic god. So how does it work? Well, the longest sustained argument to fill this gap is found in On the Principles of the Cosmos, which is in our text 1. In this text, which I will have a quick look at in a moment, this is a text which has been preserved only in Arabic. I don't know Arabic, so I have some questions that I need to ask an Arabist to clarify, but there are several versions also of the Arabic text, and this is just one of them, the only one that has been translated into English properly. So this is what we have to do with for the moment. We find in this text a further shift of emphasis in Alexander, motivated by the challenges I listed. For, with Aristotle, he has to say that the first principle is separate from the universe, but faced with Theophrastus and the Stoics and the Platonists, he does see the need for some kind of identifiable influence from the first cause through the entire universe to underlie the unification and order of the cosmos. And to this end, he introduces another nature, or power, which is entailed by, that is the problem, the motion of the divine heavenly bodies, and he calls it a divine power, a taia dynamis. This way, he doesn't need to touch the position of the first cause, but he can sort of enrich the notion of the heavenly bodies transmitting circular motions, because they are somehow transmitting one and the same power, and they do so in accordance with their own natural movements. That's when nature comes in as a diversifying factor. So to make all these claims palatable to the reader, Alexander avails himself of a number of analogies. The single ruler of a city, the single law of a city, which the citizens know and strive to obey, and the leader of a household or a city, which consists of free men and slaves. Let's see what he does with these examples. I've printed them in bold on the handout of text 1. So this nature and power are the cause of the unity and order of the world. In the same way as happens in one city, having one ruler, so the unity is a point, is in it, not separate from it. We also say that a certain spiritual power, immaterial power, penetrates the whole world and holds its parts together. And this is then sort of embellished, to be made stronger by turning the ruler into a law. Because the law is continuous, eternal, imperishable, etc. And that is exactly what it causes the universe to be. In fact, although the citizens, of course, are animate beings, have souls and knowledge and desires, Alexander rather quickly, and there's not much argument for that, proposes that this kind of relationship of everything to the single ruler or the single law applies to really everything in the world, not only to animate beings. Then in 132, since the nature penetrating all parts of the world is a divine power, it follows and turns to the most actually excellent beings, or all things which share in it, do so according to the state and position of each one of them in relation to it. So the nature of the lower things is not, at least not at this stage, so much created first cause, but it explains why they respond in different ways to the first principle. What the household picture adds is that there is a degree of receptivity, you might call it. It sounds very Neoplatonic at this point, but I don't think it is in the end. The leader of a household shares most of his knowledge or causation of arrangement and order to the free men in the house. The slaves in the house have a nature which does not allow that much reception of order and arrangement, so they have less of it, and therefore they also contribute less to the preservation of the order. So this can also be transposed to the universe. So there is a difference of degree. There's only one principle, one cause, one divine power, but it turns out differently at different levels because its single power is received by things with different natures. And that's a way for Alexander to get diversity, and a well-ordered diversity in the universe, without a first cause that actually has the first principles of everything, as in Platonism. And so it's bottom up, but still unified. Summarizing, Alexander, that's what I always do. Alexander uses these analogies to illustrate the pervasion of a single power present in the whole, in different degrees. The power starts from the motion of the outer sphere, which is itself moved by the first cause, which is its primary object of desire and thought. It is not a power of creation, but a power of arrangement and preservation of order. It is helpful. How am I with time?
You are. Yes, it is. As previously, we will take time from the general discussion.
Okay.
Because sessions we have no general discussion, but now we will take this time.
Okay, good. Thank you. It is helpful to compare Alexander's use of these analogies with the use of the same analogies, partly in the De Mundo, which, remember, Alexander thought was actually by Aristotle. The De Mundo in chapter 6 has an endless list of analogies that describe the relation of the first principle with the universe. So in one way or another. And Bettig and Gregorich have argued persuasively, I think, that this whole avalanche of analogies is meant to correct itself, right? To have one analogy which misses a point and then you add another which clarifies it. The first, most elaborate analogy is the king of Persia. The king of Persia is living in a wonderful palace, invisible to most of his people, and he issues a single command, and due to all the people that work for him, his commands are executed all throughout the empire, and he hears back from all the corners of the empire. There is a qualification here, because the God of the universe, again, is not fitting to do any real planning, and he doesn't need hired help. So this is going to be more simple even than the immense power of the great king of Persia. And then we get a number of further analogies, which each illustrate points that Alexander also needs, but he hasn't taken over all of these analogies. So there's one action, but one action can give rise to different kinds of effects. Engineers do that when they have these contraptions where you just shift one thing and then a whole set of effects follows. Puppeteers use one string to create various motions at the same time. You can also picture yourself throwing different mathematical shapes in one throw, and they will move differently according to the nature of the mathematical shapes. So this is about single action, multiple effects. But of course, if you throw these mathematical solids, you don't really have control about how they will behave. So you still don't really get much order, it seems. So that's where the chorus leader and the army come in. The chorus leader is in control over the effects that his signaling of even singing certain sounds cause. There's the army signal, one trumpet, and every soldier knows what they have to do. This is nice because the soldiers sort of understand and interpret the signal in their own way. So there also is a nice illustration which is based on not so much on perception but on understanding of how the nature of the receiver determines the variety of the effects. The soul is an analogy because it is itself imperceptible but has perceptible effects. And the last and most important one, the law of the city, is again, as in Alexander, an important illustration because it is itself imperceptible, it doesn't change, it doesn't do anything. It is known and understood in the souls of lots of different people that nevertheless cooperate in one city. Now, all of this can be transformed into a picture of the universe. It will now be clear that Alexander's divine power, illustrated by this, it seems, the same type of analogies, has a different character. It's not so much the power of, or the power issuing from the substance of the first cause, but it is the power enshrined in a certain way in the movements of the heavenly bodies and their role in the existence of the sublunary elements. And his use of the analogies brings this out. There's one ruler established in it, in the city, not separate from it. So that is where the divine motion has to do, divine power has to do the work, in the universe. The same with the law. Everything is oriented towards that principle, and that orientation makes that makes for the preservation of our arrangement and order. And each respond in accordance with their own nature. One final question remains, and that is the question that, fortunately for us, Alexander literally poses at the beginning of his Quaestio 2.3. Again, the terminology of nature is introduced here. The divine power is itself a nature, and contrasted with the nature of the elements and the nature of more complex bodies. From a passage of the Metaphysics commentary, it is clear that Alexander wishes to exclude, in whatever he is going to say, that the order in nature is the result of a model or the result of a reasoning process. That is bad. That is Platonism. So both options to conceive of the divine power have to keep it apart from any kind of rational planning of the universe. Alexander, and here it becomes irritating, Alexander gives us two options how to conceive of the divine power, but he doesn't choose. He leaves us with two stories. I believe the second one is preferable and closer to his philosophy. Now, the first option is the divine power reaches the elements after their constitution. So there are already elements, and then this power sort of trickles down through the different spheres down to the sublunary world. But then he asks a lot of questions. So what then does this power, it is a divine power, but what does it do? Because the elements already have their natural motions, they are already established, so what use does it have? Well, he says perhaps that is the late arrival of the divine power explains why the elements are not alive. They don't have souls, which seems to suggest that a divine power is a power that creates a soul. Okay. But then he says, does it also work the same way in higher compounds? So you have the elements mixed into higher compounds, and then some of them can be alive and you get the soul. But then again, what does it contribute if it comes after the establishment of the bodies that are going to be alive? So for the first option, we only get questions. For the second option, we get less questions. So that's why I believe he might actually opt for this one. What if we say, and you can, by the way, you can see that in the second text. So what I'm saying is all written down in the second handout. First the question, and then the first solution is that the power comes to be in the simple bodies afterwards, and perhaps also in other bodies. Or, and that's the next option at the bottom of the page, one could say that the power from the divine bodies is the cause of the difference of the simple bodies. And they're coming to be, itself coming to be their form and nature. Now this is tricky. How does this work? It cannot, power itself is a nature, but it doesn't have the forms of everything in it. So the differentiation has to be in virtue of the distance between the first cause and the elements. And of course, of the four elements, fire is closer to the nature of the heavenly bodies, so that's going to be easier, so to speak. So it is the distance from the first cause that gives rise to the difference between the four elements. Then, at least, the divine power has contributed something essential to the constitution of the elements. And this option fits better with Alexander's theory of emergence of forms in the De Anima. For he claims that the elements mix, and at some point they allow for the emergence of souls, different souls, for different mixtures of the elements. So all of this can be linked now to the divine power, which is one power with multiple effects, yielding four elements, which by mixture and emergence create a variety of forms. It may seem far-fetched, but it does seem to be consistent if we put all these texts together. And finally, which I won't do for the time, if we hold this solution, this second solution, against the attack by Atticus, you will see that every bit of that attack has now been refuted. Conclusions. The notion of nature comprises souls, forms, and the divine power itself. The divine power is the effect of this desire of the heavenly bodies for the first cause. So the first cause doesn't issue that power, nor actually do the heavenly bodies issue that power, but it is the effect of their movements. The transmission through the heavenly bodies creates a variety of results due to the differences in nature between the heavenly motions and the distance from the outer sphere. What started in Aristotle as a specific solution for the desire or the love of the heavenly spheres for the first principle is now translated into an orientation of all parts of nature to the first nature from which this divine power has trickled down, both animate and inanimate beings. Thus, I'm happy to say at the end of my talk, the universe has been unified without giving in to Theophrastus, Platonists or Stoics. Thank you.